And we're pleased to welcome back Christopher Sabatini, Senior Research Fellow for Latin America, the U.S. and the Americas program at the think tank Chatham House. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thanks for having me.
Former Venezuelan president in a U.S. Courtroom, the optics of it were novel the first time. 2 months on, they're still kind of novel.
Yeah, he's the former head of state who was extracted in a really quite spectacular military special forces operation, removed from his bunker with his wife, flown immediately to Brooklyn, where he's been in prison, and now he's in prison scrubs. It is a surprising thing. It's not unprecedented. The United States did the same in 1989 and 1990 with Manuel Noriega in Panama, but that was a long time ago. And in this case, too, there's allegations of narcotics trafficking, for some of them quite credible, frankly. But in this case, there was no real election or democratically elected leader that went into power after the removal of Maduro, as there was in Manuel Noriega's case. So, basically they left the government intact and just removed the leader. And despite what the commentator said before, a lot of the government structure of Nicolas Maduro remains in place, including a lot of the corruption, including narcotics trafficking that he's being accused of. It's still going on. Those who are guilty are still involved and still deeply embedded in the government or control large areas of territory.
We heard Donald Trump earlier this week saying he'd already enacted regime change in Iran with the killing of the supreme leader. When you compare the two, is it a similar scenario on that score?
Well, I think it's similar in Donald Trump's mind. He's talked about the Venezuela option as what he wants to pursue, and not just Iran, but also in Cuba. But those two countries, Iran and Cuba, are very different from Venezuela. They're very revolutionary, disciplined, very tightly controlled governments that have penetrated society, whereas in contrast, the Venezuelan government was deeply corrupt, deeply fragmented, and different power centers and fiefdoms spread across the country, spread across the government. What Donald Trump did in both cases, Iran and Venezuela, was effectively decapitate the president. One case, he killed the supreme leader of Iran, and the other, he removed him. But in both cases, that isn't regime change. Regime change comes from taking an autocratic government and staging a series of negotiations or conditions that would lead to some form of a democratically elected government that replaces the previous regime that was, in both cases, sort of the target of the Donald Trump administration wrath, or also complicit in a number of illicit activities. So, no, this isn't regime change. It's simply decapitation.
Yeah, and there's not regime change, but there is regime evolution. We saw on Wednesday the president replacing the longtime defense minister, General Vladimir Padrino, seen as a powerful figure. He's been sidelined in favor of Gustavo Gonzalez Lopez, head of intelligence, described as the nation's torturer by his critics. Your thoughts on this switch?
I'm not sure that's so much evolution in a frontward way. It's just sort of a sideways motion. Because as you mentioned, Gonzalo Lopez was head of the Army intelligence. He's been accused credibly of being involved in human rights abuses. He had been sanctioned, in fact, by the Obama administration during a crackdown. So no, this isn't a significant improvement, if you will. He may be a little more loyal to Delcy Rodriguez, so it's an improvement for her. But his hands are very bloody from this past regime. So loyalty may count. And he's perhaps a little less toxic than Padrino Lopez, certainly a little less allied to Maduro. But no, this is not evolution. And most of the cabinet does remain in power. There are some interesting changes in the electricity sector and in other sectors in which they put in technocrats rather than military officers. But again, the infrastructure, the apparatus of the previous government remains in place, including, most importantly, the Interior Minister, Joel Cabello, who was also indicted originally with Nicolas Maduro and has a $25 million bounty on his head. I believe that's the amount for crimes against humanity or narcotics trafficking and human rights abuses and corruption. So, no, the same gang is pretty much in place, maybe a little bit of moving around in the deck chairs, but that's it.
And for Delcy Rodriguez, his Joel Cabello, a fateful ally here or a potential threat?
it's a difficult call. No one really knows what goes on in the inner circles and the inner hallways of the power in Venezuela. Some people say he is a threat to her. Some people say that there could even be a case of good cop, bad cop. You know, Joel Cabello runs his own paramilitary groups, colectivos, and that gives a certain margin of deniability to Delcy Rodriguez when colectivos act against protesters, as they recently did against a group of workers who are protesting for higher wages. Or the other possibility, of course, is yes, because Joel Cabello has his own private army, if you will. It's easier for Delcy Rodriguez to keep him there, give him a certain element of autonomy, and keep him off her back. We really don't know, but what is surprising is many people thought when Maduro was removed and Delcy Rodriguez was tapped by Trump to replace him, many people thought Diosdado Cabello was going to be next.
Christopher Sabatini, you mentioned Cuba earlier. Here in Europe, there are many who fear that a Donald Trump who comes out of this Iran campaign wounded will turn on Ukraine. What about in the Americas? What happens to Cuba after this Iran war is over?
Again, we really don't know what the calculation is. Certainly, he has bitten off more than he can chew. Venezuela, Iran, and now Cuba. In the case of Cuba, he took advantage of basically seizing Maduro and replacing him with a more compliant or pliant ally that then cut off the gifts that of free oil or subsidized oil that Venezuela had been giving to Cuba that have been keeping Cuba barely alive. It's been in the midst of a humanitarian crisis since the end of COVID, when it lost a lot of its tourism, and also oil production as it was declining in Venezuela. There's less going to Cuba. Now they're in the midst of a full-blown humanitarian crisis. 40% of the population lives in absolute poverty. The majority of the population only gets by on one meal a day. Hospitals are closed, schools are closed. They've had just this week alone 2 nationwide blackouts. That has also meant that people can't pick up the garbage. The garbage trucks have no fuel, so there's a real risk of disease. In this particular case, Donald Trump is inflicting real serious humanitarian harm on the Cuban people for a strategy that we really don't know where it's going to go. Is he hoping somehow to arrange some sort of shuffling of the people and cosmetic changes in the Cuban government that will allow him to lift the embargo? He can't do that if there isn't a full democratic transition according to the embargo law. But by the same token, this crisis continues to drag on, and the Cuban government, which is, again, an autocratic, brutal government, it's more concerned about its survival. It's not going to open up simply because Donald Trump says so. There are leaders there who would face indictment, prosecution, time in prison, quite frankly, if they were to yield power. So they're in this for the long haul, even if it means the more suffering of their own people.
Christopher Sabatini, so many thanks for joining us from London.
Thank you.
Stay with us. There's more to come. We'll be taking a look at how the war in Iran is impacting inflation. That's coming up here on France 24.